So I'm gonna get mic'd up here as I get the show going. My background, I've been in the cloud game for over 15 years now. Worked at a bunch of transformational companies like RightScale, Bitnami, an open source arms dealer to the cloud providers. You probably used a Bitnami image if you ever ran WordPress. I currently work for Flexera, and I give them a big shout out because they have a motto called "Give Back," and we should all be giving back to our community. And they supported my attendance here. They took care of my travel and sending me down here. So huge shout out to Flexera. We provide FinOps capabilities for managing your cloud spend. We're also looking at how that applies to AI and how AI applies to FinOps. So my talk today is really about open source policy and its importance to everything that we've talked about here. And I'm presenting this, but really I got to give a huge shout out to Sam Johnston, pAI board member in absentia. He wasn't able to join us today due to an unforeseen circumstance, and I'm going to do my best to represent him. I also thank him for a lot of the content and slides that I'm going to be presenting here today. And his work that he's doing with the Open Source Alliance. So let's start with a definition of open source. Well, open is relatively well understood, freely available, accessible. Source has a bit of a different connotation. If I have a water bottle, I wish I had a prop here, but if I had a water bottle, I could open it, I could drink the water, but is that water the source? Is the object itself the source? No, the source is the spring that water came from. So when we think about open source, this is really the source of the innovation, the source of where the thing come from, the source of the salmon, the source of the water, the source of the code, or the source of the data. And many of you have seen XKCD. Wouldn't be a conference without seeing some XKCD. There is a $30 billion industry built on open source, growing to $80 billion. $8.8 trillion of economic activity is underpinned by open source. 97% of software runs with open source libraries. So this is not the first thing that we really want to do here as we're developing AI systems is to do no harm to open source. Open source is hugely important. It's hugely important for all of us to take a piece of it. It's really based on the 4 essential freedoms, and these are a bit simplified here, but the 4 essential freedoms, Free Software Foundation, to use the software, to be able to study the software, to modify it, and to be able to share it freely. Those are the 4 essential freedoms of the Free Software Foundation. Again, modified just a little bit for the sake of the formatting. The open source definition evolved to break these down and to kind of make it a little more tangible in real life. It talks about the free redistribution, the source code, the derived works, integrity of the author, the distribution of the license, and it broke these things down into 10 essential pieces of the definition. And this works pretty well. The problem is with number 2 now, the source code. With AI systems, the definition of source code is evolving a bit. The code of an AI model is frankly just a little sliver on top of the weights of the data. Open source definition, a project from Sam Johnston, is trying to make sure that we all have a say into how this definition evolves, now that this definition is evolving, and I'll get to that. These, licenses exist. There are, I think, 98 licenses, maybe 90 too many. But, open source licenses really govern the distribution of those things. These are all licenses that are compliant with the open source definitions, one of many more that are found there. But to take a little history tour here, this really kind of all got to start with those 4 essential freedoms, the formation of the Free Software Foundation back in 1985. There's a long-haired Linux guy that was really pissed off that Xerox wouldn't let him get the notifications from the copy machine. And so he started building something out in the open. 1991, Linus released the Linux kernel. That really catalyzed a lot of the reason why we're all here today. 97, the Debian social contract. These are a bunch of folks that got together and said, Bruce Perrins, Eric Raymond got together and said, you know, we like the free software ideas, but it needs to be a little more business friendly. Let's write some licenses for it. 98, the year later, these same folks got together and formed the Open Source Initiative and the first draft of the open source definition. It was actually Christine Peterson that coined the term open source, so shout out to Christine and her work, Netscape. There were 10 revisions of that up and through you know, the years here. In 2007, cloud computing came out, and OSI was rather, they were not really participant in how cloud computing started to change the definition of this. So along came AGPL, again from the Free Software Foundation. 2017, artificial intelligence, the publication of Attention is All We Need, and then you know, ChatGPT a couple years later, you know, really capitalizing on that, and that's where things really started to kind of come off the rails for the definition. And we have a current situation now with the release of the open source AI definition, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of where things are headed here. But back to history for a moment. You know, we actually talked a lot about this back when Quake was released, because you know, Quake came out and said, hey, Quake is open source. Well, the Quake engine was open source, but all the data that made up Quake, the textures, the monsters, the you know, gameplay and all of that wasn't open source. So you know, they started trying to, you know, hey, Quake's open source. Well, no, the Quake engine's open source. You can see all the forks that came of it you know, since then, but it wasn't the game Quake. And you know, there's a parallel here to that, to today's AI models. Without the data, is it really the model? Is it really open source? I talked about the Affero GPL license a little bit. This created what's called the service provider loophole in 2007, which was basically service providers able to say, well, we don't have to convey, you know, the bits here. We can deliver it over the network as a service. And you know, that's something that's really being capitalized now by those, you know, centralized AI services. Attention is all you need in 2007, and as Sam likes to say, super clippy in 2022, ChatGPT. This is where it really started coming off the rails. And even the Free Software Foundation, you know, methodical and maybe a bit late to make a lot of noise in this area, but even they're starting to realize that, look, with these new AI models, you know, the system is not just the source code. You know, I don't say that my laptop is open source. It runs Mac OS, definitely not open source. That's built on open source, FreeBSD. I have open source software on it, like Homebrew, but the Mac itself, the computer, the system is not open source. But we have an issue now where there are definitions evolving that seem to state that, hey, you don't need all of the things that make software open and free to study, to distribute, and to create business on. So a little bit about this slide, just the openness versus completeness. Open source definition over there, 1.9, current version from the Open Source Initiative. Very open, but not very complete into how these things are operationalized. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Linux Foundation came out with a version, the Model Openness Framework, which has a big long checklist of all the things, a very complete checklist, but they actually fail on the test of openness, and I'll talk a little bit more about that too. The open source AI definition is extremely controversial right now in that it's failing both in the test of openness and completeness. And so this is really where the challenge is, and the open source definition work in progress, which I'll end on, is an attempt to address that. So the Model Openness Framework from the Linux Foundation, you know, very complete, you know, lots of different classes. Two things here that I've highlighted. You know, one is that it says, hey, we require the data set, but it says with any license or even unlicensed. So, you know, Common Crawl, which is a dump of the internet, you know, which includes all things that are unlicensed content, is acceptable here. So maybe it's not open. It also is actually requiring documentation, which you know, has never been asked for before in a definition of open source, and you know, it's not necessarily needed to add, frankly. You know, you could have a quantum library that's code, that's uncommented code that, you know, 2 people in the world understand. But if you put it out there for people to study it, for people to look at it, for people to take it and use it and reproduce it, then it's open source. It's valid open source code. OSI and their open source AI definition, they said, okay, yeah, we love the 4 essential freedoms. You know, let's get some more resolution to it. We'll talk about open weights. They talk about open code, and they even say, hey, let's include the data here. That's important. But there's this big asterisk at the bottom when legally possible. So what's any lawyer at any corporation going to do is they're just going to X out that column. Oh, not possible. Sorry, not going to give the data away. Bruce Perrins is, you know, catching on to this. Again, one of the original open source definition authors and original OSI founder. Hey, this is really open washing. This is calling things open source that are not actually open source and are moving away from some of the original freedoms. There have been a bunch of excuses for this. Open source AI doesn't exist. Well, now we have good examples like Olmo, freely open source data set. Personally identifiable information like medical records in there. We got to get consent from people. Tech industry doesn't do well with consent. Text and data mining exemption. Hey, you know, we can take the data from this exemption, but that's actually only allowing the use for study, not reproduction. You know, if you compress all of Mickey Mouse and it starts regurgitating Mickey Mouse, then like that's not the same thing as studying Mickey Mouse. Now you're reproducing it. Security by obscurity. There's even the national security flag that's way, hey, we can't do open source because, you know, then this nation state or that nation state is going to run away with it. Hardware costs are an excuse. Even CSAM, child sexual abuse material, the most abhorrent material on the internet, that exists inside some of these models and has then been used by the model creator to say, oh, well, that's why we can't give you the data. Well, they can use it, but they can't give it to you. And even the EU AI Act has an exemption, and that exemption says, hey, AI models that are released under a free and open source license, they get some exemptions with regards to their transparency-related requirements, which that's now enshrined in the EU AI Act. Ben Brooks does not agree. He says that Berkman Klein Center, Harvard University there, along with Bruce, Schneier, OSAID serves a noble but altogether different purposes. It is not describing open source software. What the open source AI definition is, essentially, it's not a very particularly good example, but it's an example of an open weight definition, which, hey, the model weights are included. And the general argument is like, great, if there's a definition for this, then just call it that, don't call it open source. Because now we're conflating things that already have a general understanding in the world, the whole reason that we're here at Scale. And so the open source definition is a project, opensourcedefinition.org, where we've taken all the versions of the open source definition, and now we've got that little work in progress definition at the top. So 1.9 is the current, but what does 2.0 actually look like? So I talked a little bit about this. You know, open code, really just a sliver of the AI pyramid. Open weights gives you a little more insight into how the things work. DeepSeek, another good example of an open weights model. But open data is really the corpus that makes the whole thing work. You know, the weights kind of, you know, give some instructions, and then the code basically just animates the data. But in order to truly study an AI model, you need access to the data. So open source 2.0, this is a working group. Please get involved, opensourcedefinition.org, where we're hacking on the open source 2.0 definition and how we might take this forward with something that, you know, enshrines potentially things like the 4 freedoms. There's plenty of other suggestions that are being contributed here openly and transparently. And why is this important to pAI? Well, pAI has a bias that we just heard that education was a key, key component to all of this, user education. People should know what they're putting in their personal AI pipelines, whether it's a service that's siphoning their data or whether it's a model with particular bias. And if people don't have the ability to study those things that they're putting into their pipelines, then we can't truly have the transparency as to how we are being influenced. Because yes, the service providers have their influence. Models themselves have bias and influence based on the training data included. So we are huge proponents, again, and just to conclude here on the 4 freedoms, that software should be usable, yes. It should be studyable all the way down to the individual component pieces that make it up. It should be modifiable. You should know what pieces that you need to change if, for example, we wanted to take that CSAM out of there. And it should be shareable. So that concludes this little piece here. Thank you for all of this. Thank you to Sam Johnston for his inspiration and help putting all the slides together. Really appreciate all your time.